escogían una bretita, sino a las muy blancas, muy lindas.
Hard to believe right now, but the earliest enforced immigration restrictions passed in the United States targeted Chinese. These were the Chinese exclusion laws, which were in effect 1882 to 1943, and were passed against a group that at the time only constituted about 0.2% of the national population. The context in which this very strong hostility to Chinese and concerns about immigration arose was that during the 1870s, the United States was experiencing very serious economic depression. This also combined with California's status as a swing state in presidential elections. And at that time, most Chinese were in California, and California was very concerned about its Chinese problem. And in pursuit of California's votes and the very strong feelings of powerful parties within California, particularly the labor movement, national politicians took up the cause of the anti-Chinese movement, and the legislation was passed with a wide majority in 1882. It is important to remember this longer history because it highlights the ways in which, up until 1965, immigration restriction in the United States was based on categories decided by race and national origin. And so when we look at this problem of border control and border enforcement, every sovereign nation, of course, wants to be able to control who enters its borders, who remains, but we have to remember there is this powerful legacy associating illegal immigration, undesirable immigration, with particular races of people. Immigration restriction is also closely linked to the Chinese case because the legal precedents, the judicial renderings considering the power of the state and the lesser rights of would-be immigrants, and also the enforcement strategies were all built up around this idea that particular races of people were less welcome in the United States. And so there is this long-standing problem when we try to talk about immigration restriction today, that it had these very inequitable and also ineffective origins. Even though the Chinese exclusion laws were passed, sought to very tightly restrict the entry of Chinese, there in fact were many problems because Chinese continued to enter the country, although under terms of great duress. They were perceived as a race of being in the country illegally.
Railroad had to do a lot with the migration of Chinese from California to Colorado, New Mexico, Arizona, and Texas. In the United States, Asians have always been discriminated, and also on the other side of the border, Chinese were hired in railroad companies and also in the cotton industry, the cultivation of cotton. So on both sides of the borders, they were needed. In my times, in my generation, being a Chinese Mexican was very, very difficult because not too many families were Chinese Mexican, and I had to carry my passport in Mexico absolutely all the time. My father and I were harassed constantly by civilians and police and immigration officers in Mexico and in the United States. So my citizenship was always challenged. And even when I explained myself in Spanish, I was asked where I had learned to speak so well Spanish. For my father's case, he don't have a birth certificate because when he was born, marriage was forbidden between Chinese immigrants and Mexican women. And although my grandmother was also part Chinese, she held the Mexican citizenship. So my father didn't have a birth certificate, and although he was an outstanding professor, he used to teach at the University of Juarez, and he was a CPA, he didn't have his license, and he never got tenure in Mexico because he didn't have his birth certificate. It arrived some days before he died, for example. So we find a different situation right now for new generations, but racism hasn't died. Chinese and their children always form an extended family in any location they are at. And Linda Wong Chiu has, of course, my last name, or I do have her last name. So there is some sort of relationship there that I haven't investigated. However, even if she's not my relative, I think that the entire community of El Paso and Ciudad Juarez should be very proud of her, because she was an outstanding woman who, living in the first decades of the 20th century, had many restrictions, racial and gender restrictions that she overcame. She helped Chinese immigrants in Mexico to stay there, and also she helped Chinese immigrants to cross the border and to live in El Paso. Furthermore, she was a very cosmopolitan woman who spoke Chinese, Spanish, English, and who was an educator, and her intellectual endeavors can be seen in her children and outstanding members of her family who are very important part of the political life of El Paso. Plus, she also assisted Mexican women, not only Chinese immigrants, but also Mexican immigrants in Chinese who were deported from Mexico with their Chinese families. So she was an ambassador of all sorts, and a person whose social commitment took her to help all women, men and children who crossed her path. I read an article in a publication by students at this university, and in that article he stated that Pancho Villa hated Chinese for a good reason. Pancho Villa had found a child's finger when he was served a soup. So the author of the article, who was a student of UTEP, gave credibility to that myth without any investigation. He stated that Pancho Villa was right in hating Chinese immigrants because he had found a finger in his soup, and with that he was perpetrating a myth of that sort that has lived the Mexican community for many generations. And we can always hear jokes about chinitos, right? And that expresses a lot of racism and hatred against Chinese persons. Mexicans tend to call Chinese persons chinitos in a very paternalistic way. Stories about Chinese who are rapists, usually the victim is depicted as a very young woman or a child who was raped by Chinese, and it is very hard to indeed find documentation. However, the stories survive and they are told generation after generation.
me asustaban, ¿ves? Porque eran unos chinos con unas caras muy raras, que al verlos te daban la impresión de que algo te iban a hacer. Y lo que pasa, pues que en esa edad no tiene uno que entretenerse, menos en aquellos tiempos. Nos gustaba mucho irnos por toda la orilla del río, que era donde estaban instaladas las huertas de los chinos, que eran varios, muchos.
¿Y por qué vivían alrededor del río?
Por el agua, por el riego. Tenían sus ranchitos y no les faltaba agua. Sembraban. Y luego cuando las cosechas, pues las vendían. Vendían, de eso vivían. Pero sus costumbres de ellos, yo creo, o no sé a qué se debería, pues es imposible que uno lo sepa. Ellos tenían sus rituales, pero nunca se habían dado cuenta que en los rituales había ofrecimientos de pureza a sus dioses, yo creo, me imagino. Después las encontraron muertas en el río porque las abusaban de ellas, yo creo, o algo así. Entonces el pueblo se cansó, las autoridades, y dijeron, ¿pero qué es esto? Están matando a las puras criaturas chiquitas y bonitas. ¿No crees que cogían a una bretita? Sino a las muy blancas, muy lindas.
They never talked about their being uprooted and placed in isolation to their children because they thought that their children were going to grow up traumatized and always afraid of not being considered citizens of the United States or citizens of Mexico because of their phenotype. So they prefer not to talk about their painful experiences to protect their children. So that's in the case of Japanese immigrants. In the case of Chinese, my father was always a very cheerful person, and most Chinese immigrants that I have met prefer to relate their experiences in a very jokingly way. They always tell jokes, they always see life in a very optimistic manner.
Any country is the same. They have a not 100% not good person. That's a, they have a Korea too same, Japan, any country, Taiwan maybe have a Thailand. Any country is the same. Philippines, any country is the same too. But El Paso, my life, I happy.
Så mycket där i land gön i röna så sulking är det hän